Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much for joining us online this evening. I'm really delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture hosted by the University of Bath Institute for Policy Research. Our university is one of the leading engineering faculties in the UK. It is world-class research in water systems, circular economy systems, architectural mechanical engineering, with the newly opened IAPS Centre, the Institute for Advanced Automotive Propulsion Systems. Our architecture department has produced world-class architecture, and the engineering firm Buro Happold, which remains in Bath to this day, and many other important architectural practices have benefited hugely from the university. The department's second only to Cambridge in the Good University Guide for Architecture in the UK. Part of the excellence of our university is now integrating the engineering requirements of the climate crisis into all civil engineering and architecture courses, creating a new type of engineering for the 21st century. This opens an important debate on the role of the university in the education in a rapidly changing world. Something brought into high relief by the COVID-19 lockdowns, where technology has enabled learning and research to continue despite the restrictions. In the context of a climate emergency, however, how will these new technologies change what and how we learn? And will a more transdisciplinary approach to addressing complex problems change not only how we research, but how we teach? This evening, I'm truly delighted to welcome a most eminent person to speak to us on this topic, Dr. Michael Richey from Boeing, a company I've had the privilege of working in my own field with for many years. He, along with our own Professor Tim Eibel, will discuss these crucial issues of how engineering teaching can go forward. And he'll also showcase the work that Boeing is doing in the field of engineering. Mike and Tim, thank you both for joining us. And so without further ado, I'll pass to IPR's Director of Research, Dr. Charlie Larkin, who will introduce our speakers in more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor, for that wonderful introduction. So it comes to me as Director of Research at the Institute for Policy Research to introduce our key speaker for this evening, Dr. Michael Richey of the Boeing Company. He is an engineer. He is a associate technical fellow of Boeing, and he is their chief learning scientist and has been working on MOOCs, massive open online courses, and the development of them in the context of new types of engineering education and the response to the Industry 4.0, which is basically the new industrial revolution, and what that will mean for not only the Boeing Company, but also education more widely and for the engineering profession. The question and answer session is going to be chaired by Professor Tim Eibel from the engineering faculty. Professor Eibel is a fellow of the Royal Society of Engineering, as well as a fellow of the Institute of Structural Engineers, and a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and a very accomplished academic. He will be chairing the question. I'm sure that he will also have some very interesting questions for Dr. Richey. In addition to Dr. Richey attending this conversation, there will also be the potential for some of his colleagues, Dr. Charles Camadra and Dr. George Siemens, to answer some of the questions, both of whom have worked quite extensively on this new model of engineering education. This is part of a series of talks that the IPR will be hosting relating to challenges in Industry 4.0 and the changing education model around us, the next to be held on the 26th of May with the President Emeritus of Olin College of Engineering, Professor Rick Miller. So without further ado, I will hand over now to Dr. Mike Richey, and he will give us a very interesting talk. And for those of you that are wondering, the slides will be made available as a PDF subsequent to this event. And this event is being recorded for those that are wondering as well. So with that, I hand over to Mike.
Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate the introduction. And good evening. Good evening, all. I wanted to start out with the introduction of two of my research partners. They're on the chat, but you won't be able to hear them today. That is Dr. Charles Kermada. He's a NASA retired astronaut. He flew on the return to flight, the STS-114 return to flight. And since then, he started his own nonprofit, the Epic Education Foundation. And his research is really focused on socio-technical knowledge and the flow of knowledge through student networks. And he's really interested in getting the students to engage and build hands-on projects and look at the interaction and flow and psychological safety in those environments. So very key to our research, his research interests. Also, I'd like to introduce Dr. George Siemens. He's the Executive Director of the Learning and Innovation Network and Knowledge Research Lab at Linked and University of Texas, Arlington. He's also Executive Director of the University of South Australia, the Center for Change and Complexity. And he was one of the first professors to put MOOCs online. Him and Stephen Downs designed a massive open online course in 2008. So these are two of the research partners that we work with very closely, and they'll be available in the chat window. And I've got their bios and other links that have been given to Sophie to share. So before we get started, I wanted to introduce them and say that they're on the call. So today's discussion, let's see, one second. Today's discussion is really going to focus on the emerging technologies in this fourth industrial revolution. I'm going to cover some of the Boeing micro-credentials and how we instrumented these micro-credentials for understanding online learning. We have two of them, one in architecture and systems and engineering models and methods, and one in Boeing additive manufacturing. We'll go over the architecture of the learning characterization, how we clustered the trajectories and proficiencies of the individual agents and learners on the online platform. And then we'll talk a little bit about personal learning graphs and social networking analysis. The center of this talk is really about advancing personalized learning. It's a National Academy of Engineering grand challenge. They've set forth 14 grand challenges here in the US. Advancing personalized learning is at the center. Everything that I'll cover today is really predicated on trying to instrument online learning environments so that we can understand proficiency and trajectory and interaction and exchange within the social network and how knowledge flows across that network. So we hope that the case studies support this, and the presentation itself is pretty heavy with references. And the idea is that we'll leave this as an artifact, and if there's any piece of this research that you want to delve into deeper, I would encourage you to look at that. And then if you have any questions, you can send any of us an email on clarification. So the National Academy report on the information technology talks about the Industry 4.0 and a set of emerging technologies. And you can see in these technologies that artificial intelligence, augmented and virtual reality, big data, predictive analytics, cloud computing, brain computing interface, edge computing, quantum computing, Internet of Things, all of these things are really starting to change the landscape as far as additional skills that engineers and technicians need, especially with the advanced manufacturing as you apply them in the advanced manufacturing space. Robotics and cloud computing and cybersecurity are really key to that space. And so we're looking to build courses that can scale across the enterprise that would build these competencies up in our engineering and technical workforce. And I'm going to share two of those that we worked with MIT. One is on model-based engineering or architecture of complex systems, and it's really focused on large-scale systems integration. And for us, obviously, it's airplanes, but anything that you have to synthesize and scale globally that's large-scale and manufacturing related that architecture of these systems and quantifying the methods and models that you conduct to build these systems is really critical. So we partnered with MIT on an 85-hour class, and that's one of the case studies. A second one off this list that was really critical is additive manufacturing. And we have a handful of expertise here at the company, but to get it to scale, really in a low-cost online platform, we partnered again with MIT to build a theory to practice, where we had the faculty driving theoretical applications of additive manufacturing, and we had a close partnership where we had industry and people from the Boeing Fellowship and from General Electric and from other companies contribute to the practical application. So it's not just theory, it was a theory to practice course that we put together, and then we instrumented that course, and that's really what the rest of the talk's going to focus on. So this is the example that I talked about in the architecture of systems engineering with MIT. You can see in the lower left-hand side, it was broken into 4 courses, and each course was approximately 20 hours. This architecture of complex systems, it was a 20-hour 2 CEU 2-credit course. Models in engineering was 20 hours. Model-based systems engineering and documentation and analysis was 20 hours. And then quantitative methods in systems engineering was 25 hours. So it was an 85 hours program. You could take any one of these courses for a certificate, or for a certificate of completion in the course, or you could take all of them and get a certificate in the course system itself. And to date, I think we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 Boeing engineers that have taken this course. You can see the courses were staggered. They ran 4 to 5 weeks. They took 3 to 5 hours per week on each one of these, and they were about $350. And so we were able to get them get this theory to practice model built, put it online, and push it out to the enterprise. So we got to the entire Boeing enterprise, including our partners. On the first run of this course, we ran 1,600 people through the registered and signed the informed consent waivers, because we were looking at the data and clicks and picks behind this course. Out of those 1,565 stayed with the course after the 2-week drop period. And in that first run of this first course, and this is what I'm going to focus on the rest of the talk, the first architecture of complex systems course, the first run of this, these engineers, 1,565 engineers and technicians, generated nearly 31 million click record events on the open edX platform. And there were some students that generated over 100,000 separate events in one course, which I'll show you an example of that. We published this data in +1 on the paper, and the link to the paper is here if you want to see the details. I'm going to cover some of them in this deck. So the first, one of the first things that we did when we molded this new theory to practice, faculty to industry practitioner kind of a model, is we went through the first course, this architecture of complex systems, and we broke the course up into sections, and in each one of those sections, we would put poll results, videos, social activities, tacit knowledge that was captured in professor and industry expert examples, explicit knowledge, which was covered in the documentation and state diagrams and PowerPoints. And then we had examples and graded activity, and then we had the ability for the students to test their knowledge in each one of these sections. So this was a 20-hour section. The section 1 was probably 15 minutes or so. This was 2.5 hours. The section 3 was 4 hours. The section 4 was 4 hours. And so it all summed up to 20 hours. And then you can see how we broke the exercises, videos, and exercises into these page types so that we could start to look at where the students went, what they touched, and what they learned. We had an assessment strategy that really looked at the content and the content page types. So we understood, how much was the video, how much was social exercises, how much was graded activity, how much was content other, the explicit artifacts. And so we were able to break the content engagement down so that we could understand and instrument it. The same thing with the assessment types. We were able to break those down as well: social activities, graded activities, and project work. And the idea here is that if we could create a matrix that would enable us to a rubrics or a matrix that would enable us to understand what the student knew a priori when they went into the course, that we could place them and watch their trajectory in the course based on what they knew. So again, advancing personalized learning was really dependent on understanding and doing the assessment of the individual and learner across multiple dimensions. So within that instrumentation strategy, this is some work from George and his Dr. Siemens and his folks at the University of South Australia out of their Center of Learning and Complexity. We just published this paper not too long ago on assessing learning and multiple program strategies, like this course, where it has 4 20-hour components, and we can look at the interaction of the students, both with the consumption of the knowledge artifacts that we codified and put on the platform, and the social networking analysis that happened behind the scene as the students were interacting and consuming these knowledge artifacts and discussing them. And I'll show you some examples of that. This paper, the hot link is in the presentation here if you want to go take a look at it. Some really good work by a young graduate student out of the Center for Learning and Complexity. And so this is what some of the edX structured data look like. So the edX creates all the student log files. We can capture basic demographic, the enrollment certificates, the course structure, hierarchy, content, all of the assets that I mentioned earlier on the video, the web pages, the problem questions, and all of the interactions and clicks and picks, the daily log files, and that natural language processing that goes on in the discussion boards, all of those things. Again, as part of the +1 publication, we published the steps and the processing that we used on GitHub, and all of that data is available and de-identified on the +1 website. There's a link to GitHub where you can go get all of the processes and steps and the flow diagrams that were created out of Indiana University, another partner of ours. And so we were really looking at trying to capture every single click. If you could understand the explicit artifacts that were in that learning space and the individual agent, the learner that was engaging in those artifacts, the e-media resources, the tacit stories and tutorials that were extracted out of the experts, the explicit artifacts that they left behind, patterns, diagrams, models, 3D models, those kinds of things. And then we did pre and post assessment, and the pre was really set up to test your knowledge of that section. And if you weren't comfortable with your knowledge and you scored low, that you could go back and it would actually help you to recommend on things, on content that was posted online that you should go revisit. And I'll show you an example of that. So as I mentioned, the assessments were a really critical part of this. And then the engagement and extraction of knowledge elicitation in this tacit space and the explicit space. Combining those and codifying those so that we could look at graded exams, pre and post assessments, what they touch, what videos, what models. And in this case, I'll show you on the 3-dimensional, on the additive manufacturing software, we used a 3-dimensional tool called Onshape, and I'll show you how we use that. We actually were able to bring the 3-dimensional software into this space. And then the student would interact with these learning assets, and then they would go into the social space to discuss what they learned and some of the conceptual struggles that they were having with the concept or the content. And we could see really 2 very key things. Learning assets that were created by the instructional systems development folks that were never used, that were just atrophied. People just didn't use them. And then cognitive load, if we followed this constructivism methodology that Dr. Siemens created, and we really looked at the interaction of the students and their consumption of that material and then what they said about it. So cognitive load as they went through the course content was measured, what they touched and who they were and what level. A level 5, a level 1 mechanical engineer with 2 years experience interacted with the content completely differently than a level 6 15-year systems engineer, and we were able to look at some of those interactions and differences, and I'll show you the examples here in the next slide or two. And so there were two aspects. One, really look at the learner and the engagement in the content with an eye on using machine learning and natural language processing to understand and use intelligent agents to help the students learn when they got stuck, and I'll show you that in a second. And the other thing really was to look at the social aspects and the flow of information across network, and this is something that Dr. Kamada is engaged in, looking at the flow and interactivity across networks of the individuals in that network. And so our cohort, the 1,565 engineers and technicians, were in this space. So we got to look at who said what, where they emerged in the system, what centrality and nodes and weight and links, and who sorted in that network as experts, and what were the characteristics of those experts. You know, why were they sought? You know, it's not, these softer structures that you see in these network environments aren't hierarchical. They're really based on the background of the person, their expertise, how many things that they answer. And this is really an emergent property out of the space. And again, Dr. Siemens is working in this space, trying to understand novice expert flow patterns and novice expert networks. So we're using graph theory here. We're using knowledge-based environments. We're looking at the social interaction and flow of the information across these networks, in addition to what the students are learning. So this is an aspect that we're really looking at right now. And we've started a new program with MIT, with Dr. Pentland, Dr. Sandy Pentland, on trying to understand individual agency, group cognitive capability, and their internal and external cohesiveness, what their ties look like, how that information cognitively flows across networks, and all of those really interesting aspects that can help feed into an artificial intelligent agent that can help in teaching the course. So some of the research goals, this is too much to say here, but I'll say that we are looking at a convergent team instead of just the engineering or just the social or natural sciences. We're really looking at cognitive sciences and sociology and instrumentation and data science and federated data systems and intelligent cognitive agents and algorithms. We're trying to put all that together with this team that we have working on this, and it's just it's a convergent problem, so it requires convergent space and convergent teaming. And I think you guys have you have some familiarity with this because of the work that Professor Adel did on the joint board of moderators, the guidelines for developing degree programs documentation that he just published. And I'll see if Sophie will put that in the notes, but the same kinds of skills that you see documented in his in the JBM report are embedded in our research, and they really are on the practical skills, what the students will be able to do and demonstrate in communication through their model-based and interactivity. So there's a lot of stuff on general transferable skills and practical skills. So this language should be familiar, based on that publication. It's really a different way to say it, but the same principles. So visualizing the learning engagement. So after we built the course, we broke the course down into these force diagram networks. And here you can see architecture of complex systems. That's the top level course, the 20 hours. As you move through the course content, these are the course modules and sections. And as you move through this 20 hours, again, you'll see this 20 hours demonstrated as the introduction, and then the systems, properties, and emergent engineering. You'll see all of the topics across these top level. And then those topics all have subsequent artifacts, and they could be videos, they could be exercises, they could be social polls, and they could be tacit explanations or technical stories. And all of that produces, once instrumented, produces all of the clicks and ticks data. In this graph, I thought this is really interesting. This was an estimate on what the professors and course developers thought it would take as far as time. I mean, we made this commitment to the students. You know, they're professionals, they're working 40 hours and commuting and have families. And so they make the investment to take this course, and we say it's going to take 3 to 5 hours a week. And then we started looking at week 1 and then the courses the modules that we had in that week 1 and week 2, and then really looked at the over and under estimate of the time commitment. And you can see we were vastly underestimated, and we heard it in the students. You know, they were working 18 hours a week in something that we advertised as a 3 to 5 hour week course. So there's really interesting things that happen in the construction of the artifacts themselves from an instructional systems development perspective. Really interesting patterns as far as cognitive load, engagement, and assessment, you know, to understand where the learner is. And then the level of effort, you know, the metacognitive strategies and level of effort that they have to go through to get through some of these courses, were all enlightened by our tracking these kinds of data. Again, here's the +1 paper, but this interesting artifact out of Professor Katie Borner and Michael Glinda, one of her research scientists at the University of Indiana. This is one of the first pictures I've seen, or graphics, that demonstrate this cognitive jumping or interweaving. And what you can see here is the course introduction, the pre-assessments, getting started, the week 1, the week 2, the week 3, all the way through the post-assessment. The green, you can see the students are moving forward. Along the horizon here, these are all the artifacts in the course, the videos, the exercises, the social engagement. But what's really interesting here is you can see the forward movement in the green, and then the backward movement in the magenta. And this is really, I think, the way I read this is a metacognitive trace. They're moving forward, they're consuming some of these knowledge bits, they're talking to their groups and applying those knowledge bits, you know, to the projects that they have at hand. And you can see this backward and forward movement. And I'll show you another example of this that I can run that's really just, I think it's amazing, is looking at the interweaving that happens conceptually as you move across a set of knowledge artifacts to better understand the implications, especially when it goes from theoretical to practical and applied, which happens in the groups because you've got multivariate expertise in those groups. So I think it's a really fascinating study on interweaving. And again, it's in that publication. This is another directed cyclic network graph. And I think this is really interesting. And I'll show you why, for the reasons of artificial intelligence and using intelligent agents to help guide students. So we ran a cluster analysis, a k-means cluster analysis on the original 1,565 folks that went through, and we came up with personas. And there was probably 6 or 7 personas that you could cluster. Each cluster, there's 1,500 people, 1,600 people into 6 or 7 clusters. And this was one on the extreme end of elegant. Their metacognitive strategy and engagement in each one of these knowledge loops is pretty efficient. Again, the green's forward, the magenta's backwards, and then the legend here shows where they're going and what they're consuming. They passed with 99%. They took 16.3 hours in a 20-hour course. This particular student was a little less elegant in their interaction patterns. And really, I think it was the self-regulated learning and metacognitive strategies here were probably challenged just based on, you know, this random interaction and walk through this space. That they passed, but they spent only 14 hours in this. And I've got another slide here that gets into the details. So this is the example of the more elegant student. And you can see this is the pre-assessment. This is week 1. These are all the knowledge artifacts that were in these loops. Again, the green is moving forward. This magenta is moving backwards. And what you can really notice here is that the access to the video resources that contain really the tacit and technical stories of the narrative were heavily accessed, because the centrality and weight of this bubble is dependent on the time that the student engaged in it. The social networking was really accessed. They really worked with their teams and with their groups. And then they spent a very efficient path through this content. And so we knew exactly which artifact 23 and 24 and 25 and 26 was, and we were able to look at what they consumed, how long they spent in it, what their proficiency was when they came in, what their proficiency was when they came out. And so these are the paper that I mentioned from the Center of Complexity in Humans and Computer Sciences really delves into this latent class analysis, delves into the short and long-term memory neural network algorithms that were applied against this instrumented data set. And so this system that you're looking at here can act as the pattern for AI to recognize for the student that is struggling with the metacognitive kind of engagement and path. And they can actually, the algorithms can come in and say, well, you know, there's a key learning objective in this week 3. There were 4 learning objectives in this loop, and we can see that you missed one of them. And we know that it's related to and relevant to this week 1, these terms that we used here. And then that algorithm could actually act as an intelligent agent and say, why don't we go back here and just revisit these 3 and then come back to this and test your metal again and then move forward. And so at the end, when the student was comfortable, they could test out and they could collect their grade for each one of these artifacts, each one of these loops, these knowledge loops, and then it would sum up for their grade for the 20-hour course itself. So this is the example on the course that I talked about a few minutes ago. And I can't run this, the servers down right now, but what you can see is the same. This is one individual, and they had a master's level education. They were born they had this gender, they had this level of engagement. This was their expertise. And we can see again in the individual how they went back and forth and back and forth. And this particular person spent, I think it was 80 hours and a 20-hour class, and they got 100%. So obviously, you know, they were perfectionists, and they were going to get this right. But they spent quite a bit of time in it and revisiting all the knowledge artifacts and going back and forth as they learned a new concept, and they tried to reconcile it with something else that they heard or another learning asset that was historically back in the timeline. You could see these metacognitive traces from this individual. And we have these personas, like I said, 6 different personas, which I think we can do better at. But these personas are kind of critical for helping to train the agents on where to step in and where to help with the metacognitive strategies and paths. So this course, now we're switching to the additive manufacturing course. And this course was kind of interesting. And this course, the first run of this course, there were 930 students actively enrolled and went through the 2-week drop period. So here you can see week 1 in the additive manufacturing course. The same exact thing was done. All these assets, learning assets, were put online and opened all at the same time. So you can see week 1, introduction and implications, week 2, processes, week 3, so on, so on. At week 8, we stopped the formal training and we gave them this Onshape 3-dimensional software. And we said, based on the principles that were embedded, the learning principles that were embedded in the prior 7 weeks, we want you to build a 3-dimensional part, and we want you to export it, the STL file, to a 3D printer if you have one. And so that's what we did. We broke the kids up, we broke the learners up into student teams. They had implications, structural, material implications, process implications like design for manufacturability or design for indexing, self-indexing. There were lightning requirements as far as structurally lightening the product itself. There was also economy of design challenges where they would try to take 2 or 3 parts and make them into one additive part. And at the end, they modeled up their part and they went away for 3 weeks. And then we kept journals, a weekly journal on what the students learned and what they talked about on their discussion boards. And then at the end of this, we brought them back and had the future of AM production systems. And we had the students peer evaluate their models because they had to create a model. It had to infuse all of the learning and functional objectives that were in the content itself. But one interesting thing that's very difficult to see in this slide is that you can see very wispy, small gray lines here. And what we found is that dependent on the learner and their a priori knowledge, that they would go into this space and they would start moving through these clusters and say, I'm really interested in design for additive manufacturing. And they would jump from this content to this content. And then they would say, I'm really interested in cost value, and they would jump down here. And then they'd come back up to the processes and only engage in part of this. And so why this is important, especially with intelligent cognitive agents, is that depending on the learner's prior knowledge, and if you go back to the very beginning of the deck where we were talking about advancing personalized learning, that our goal is to really look at artificial intelligence and intelligent cognitive agents in these instrumented systems to look at and interact with learners authentically. If you have a 16-year systems engineer that has 4 years of additive manufacturing, and this course is a 60-hour course, then you don't really need to go through 60 hours of formal content. You can come in here and challenge some of these things and test out. You could go right to this section for cost value if you really needed to know the balance between what you're thinking about designing an additive and its traditional high-speed machining counterpart. You really don't have to be locked in either the time, a semester, a quarter, or 60 hours worth of content, or the topics, where you're exposed to one level of concept before you get exposed to the next. And you could see these wispy marks all over the place, because once we let the students in, depending on their interest and authentic engagement and prior knowledge, they pretty much consume this the way they wanted to. And this is what all these bullets here say. Now I'm going to move on to the next one, which is kind of interesting. If you think about what this would require to take it to the next step, and this is the stuff that we're really working with Dr. Kamada and Dr. Siemens on, is where would we store, one, codifying this information online, and really who does it serve? It serves a professional learner for sure. It probably should serve undergraduate, any undergraduate. I mean, by the time you get to undergraduate, you should be able to, you should have self-regulated learning strategies and good metacognitive processes to engage in these online content and create value in some social network. You should be able to do that by the time you get into undergraduate education. And so what does that look like? How would we codify this data? How would we use these environments and intelligent cognitive agents to set on top of this and help the authenticity of the learner and to advance that learner from a personal perspective? Well, we need an integrated learning knowledge system. We need to focus on a federated data system. We need to understand and apply, these intelligent cognitive agents as tutors. We'd have to look at as 4.0 unrolls, and we think about what's suitable for machine learning and what will humans do. We'd have to think about human-machine capital and knowledge management separation. It's happening, and we're on it, and so we're trying to figure out what do we have to instrument, and how can we engage the individual and authentic human into learning through these emergent learning paths. So this is a paper we haven't published. We're working on it right now. This paper really talks about the federated data infrastructure. This is from Dr. Siemens and his team. We're talking about how would we instrument this data? How would we structure the courses so that we understand where the students are, what they're selecting, where they're going, what their proficiency is, what the cognitive load is, how they can test their mettle, and then finally get to some place where they can test out. We're trying to understand the structure of the content itself from an ISD and cognitive load perspective, how you might instrument that data, where that data would go. And in this case, we've got this sandbox in AWS, where all of the data and the survey and the discussion boards and all that stuff drops into this data lake. It's cleaned and trimmed and curated. Then it moves on to taxonomy and monitoring and notification and alerting, which is the AI section in this Elasticsearch space. This is an example of what you could produce out of that. This was a static diagram, meaning that we generated it after the course was done, but there is no reason, and we're working to do this now with the Center of Learning and Complexity, is to hook the data in the course directly through the database and produce these kinds of algorithmic geographic kind of patterns in real time. So we could look at this course and look at a cohort of students, and we could look at this dynamically. Each time they click something, it would just run through the database and show us this dynamic pattern of really knowledge flowing across social networks. And these are the things in the paper that are identified, that things that we think that we have to go do and things that we need from a federated data structure and a codification approach. And the last couple slides is really on what we're focused on with the Center for Learning and Complexity and the University of Texas, Arlington. And this is this notion of intelligent cognitive agents. And I've talked about it in the prior slides. But we did work with NSF, and there's a really good reference here on intelligent cognitive agents. There's a lot of work going on in here. Let's see, I think it was NASA that just published on SBIR, a small business request that looked at, and Charlie can talk about that looked at trying to relieve the load of the interaction of the agent of the engineers and technicians as they sort through and get access to design artifacts in any network. You know, how can we use intelligent cognitive agents to do that more efficiently? There's a really good paper here in a workshop that we participated in with IBM a couple of years ago. Here's the results of that field. And then here's two things that are really a focus of challenge on what we're really struggling with. And this is this mapping the correct AI and concepts from the human side, what they're doing. In this case, you see inquiring, reasoning, induction, deduction, analogy, and things of that nature. And what algorithmic, with this explainable AI or XAI, might we cluster against these data systems that are codified and drop into data systems that then we can run these algorithms against. Some of the big challenges, and George has brought this up, this notion, this illusion of explanatory depth. You know, people feel they understand things and they don't. And this is part of the epistemic knowledge that's in the network itself, trying to get some precision there. This Polanyi's paradox, where, you know, people know more than what they say. And this epistemic dependency, where you have interaction and bits of knowledge that reside in the network, and no one person has all of that knowledge, and how you extract and codify those kinds of systems. So those are challenges. The last slide here is on suitability for machine learning and future research. And if you think about systems, one more slide here. When you think about systems, this paper from Professor Brett Johnson from Stanford is talking about what will machines do and what will humans do. And again, it's codifying that human interface, looking at agents, and then machine learning and deep learning and neural networks that can that we can algorithmically interrogate these data sets, both through sensors, machines, and people. There's some really good work out there that's done from University of Australia on hybrid human-machine behavior and interface. This is people, this is robots, sensors, data, models, and then people and their interface. And then this notion of suitability for machine learning, as you start parsing out some of these functions and what's suitable for computational analysis, and then what's suitable for the human interaction. You know, what does that look like? How do you parse that? What kind of data algorithms do you use to interrogate and optimize those kinds of things? It's going to require a whole different team, and that means the socio-technical expands with cognitive psychology, sociologists, you know, brain scientists. I mean, if you think about the National Science Foundation and the work that they're doing in the area of convergence, they're bringing together, and the same thing with the Santa Fe Institute here in the States in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, New Mexico. They're really bringing together a very, very different team of experts to look at course graining and understanding their discipline as it applies to some of the key challenges that you see on this slide here. And they really do cover the gamut from understanding at the neural level to understanding at the procedural and cognitive level. And all of these things are really driving these major differences and understanding humans and codifying knowledge. And the last slide here really is looking at this again from this notion of socio-technical knowledge. And again, in the JBM report that I referred to earlier, you're coming to this, I mean, you've already come to this realization, and you're talking about engaging people with living systems, buildings and smart cities and smart networks. And it's the same with large scale systems, that the expertise resides in the network. That expertise can be codified to some degree, and that interaction can then be extracted algorithmically from machine artifacts and design data, and from the knowledge that's within the network. And this is some of the ways that we're trying to do this with knowledge graphs and things of that nature, with these database codified databases. So that's it for my talk. I hope I haven't ran out of time, and if there are any questions in the chat, I'd be happy to address them.
Mike, thank you so much. That was incredibly fascinating. I knew it would be. Just to let everybody else in on a secret, I met Mike a week or two ago, and we had a good conversation, and I knew it was going to be brilliant. So thank you so much. Fantastic, Mike. There are several questions which have come in, and I need to be careful here because I've got loads myself, but I need to give others a chance. So I'm going to read some of them out for you, Mike, if I may. In order in which others have asked for these to be asked. How did you monitor the algorithms created for machine learning to avoid bias and ensure an ethical approach to learning? As we know, technology is not neutral. I'm interested to see how you manage that topic.
I really appreciate that question. And I think ethics, informed consent, and stripping identity away from all data is a critical component of this. So we're not looking at the individual, we're looking at the collective behavior. But I also could make the argument that why these algorithms are biased. There are biases within the algorithms that eventually, through optimizing these algorithms, I think that we can get past that. I think that eventually these algorithms may be less biased than we are, and that's an evolutionary thing that we're headed for. But until then, the being ethical and protecting the privacy of the data, and de-identifying and hashing this data in a way that's ethical is at the top of our list. I mean, we have no interest in anything other than the broader patterns that can express a deeper level of engagement with the students and their interaction with this content. So it's a great question. It's got to be at the front of the PowerPoint as far as ethics and our responsibility there. But I think that ultimately, as we get better and better at this, if you can imagine an individual student interacting and learning authentically and opening up that intellectual capital, the rewards are worth the risk.
Thanks, Mike. I agree entirely. Ethics, if fundamentally we could just say that education is all about ethics, frankly. Could I just let everybody who's in this understand that Mike's Wi-Fi is a bit iffy, which is why Mike does not have his video on, just in case anybody was wondering. Mike, the next question is, do you engage with students after the course to monitor how that applied learning was indeed learned?
Another excellent question, and I'm not just saying that. I think that dimension of engaging in the students, and we've got a paper on this where we tried to look at the applicability of the concepts that, and the value of that inside our company. And it's the ethnographic data and discourse, and trying to understand and extract the information of what they came back, what they applied, and how it was optimized is pretty costly. It's really worth doing, especially with follow-up interviews and things of that nature. And so, yes, we have. And one thing we haven't done, and I'm really interested in doing, is to look at the networks that were formed. So in this architecture course, we had people from Daimler Chrysler, people from Pratt & Whitney, people from Boeing. There were a bunch of companies that were engaged in that content at the same time. And so when you think about large-scale systems and you think about how insular a company might be, when you expose that the learning opportunity, you have multiple companies with different cultures and perspectives and networks that can be brought to bear to solve some solution in that space. It's really valuable. And have we looked at it? No. Is it worth looking at? Yeah, you bet. And we hope to do that, but we're very small effort here. And so we hope to grow into that space. So I hope that answered the question. And I want to see if there's, I know that I don't think George or Charlie can add on the chat, can they?
I believe that George,
Yep.
I can
Charlie
see.
or sorry, Michael. Yeah, I do have audio. They gave me a promotion.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
George, would you like to add to that answer?
No, I think one of the things you saw from Michael's presentation, and it takes a slightly different direction, is there's a huge sequence of significantly interconnected elements in the work that Michael is doing. And this is one of the challenges of complex systems is in a traditional linear relationship, we try and identify one thing and say, we want to raise student grades, and then someone will come by and say, oh, let's add a tutor, or let's do this. And so we treat it as a pretty linear kind of a connection. And what you see with the slides that Michael put together here, you can see he's addressing this from a range of angles. He's looking at it from a learner pathway angle. He's addressing it from some of the psychological attributes, with the big five, if you will, that are included, and covering it from everything from content to curriculum to the people, the learning graphs, and so on that are affiliated. So I think one way to look at the difficulty that entails is it's not just one variable you're trying to tweak. You're dealing with a range of dynamics and a range of concepts. And I think that's one of the things why what Michael's addressed here is both so promising, but also I think potentially quite difficult for organizations to wrap their head around, because it's moving everything all at once, which really is the function of a complex system. So I just want to put that as in response to what Michael had shared, but that's sort of the orienting perspective to keep in mind, that we're dealing with a complexity science approach to addressing organizational learning change, not a traditional linear mechanic relationship.
Thank you very much, George. Could I extend that again, if I may? Mike, I often am asked, I'm sure you are, what the difference is between education and training. There are various definitions. My one is that education is discovering what you don't know, whereas training is discovering something which other people do know. That's how I define the difference. And it intrigues me with how this system is set up with that. Where is the balance between education and training? If you could use that very simplistic definition, bear that in mind. Where does this lie? And where does the artificial intelligence aspect of it lie between education and training?
I'd really like to hear George's view on this, but this notion of we teach them how to think and you teach them how to do, I don't subscribe to that. I think that when you're in a network and you're moving from a novice to an expert, whether you're a sushi chef or a car mechanic or an aerospace mechanic, that notion is embedded socially, and it's not a separation. And although I do agree that some of the humanities really do add a level of sophistication to the education of engineers and techs, I do see that the 3+2 schools really, they really do produce what they call T-shaped, somebody that's really understanding of how to interact in a more global space. But I think the separation is smaller than most people like to believe. I mean, ultimately, people want to go to work and they want to have meaningful engagement and pay their mortgage. And I think thinking and doing kind of coexist. So, George, I know you're in the academic space. Can I have you put your neck on the chopping block and tell us?
Well, it's a really good question, especially the education, training dimension and the role of AI. I think at a really big level, one of the things to be aware of is what does AI do? And perhaps one of the best ways to describe it, and this was a recent book that looked at called Pattern Seekers, which look at sort of the origin of autism in terms of human creativity and innovation. And one of the components there was that one of humanity's most substantial contributions that elevated us to, I guess, the top of the proverbial food chain was our ability to make systems and to make those systems produce consistent and anticipated outcomes. With AI, it just accelerates that enormously and potentially maybe adds a little bit of a creativity component to it as well. especially as you start getting AI that develops recipes and does things like that. So it's a long way of me saying that the AI side of it is at this stage a systemizing influence, but far beyond anything we've ever encountered before, meaning it is exceptionally capable at doing things that are routine and mundane. And that may change over time, but for the time being, at least this is one of the key contributors that we have from AI. When it comes to education and training, then we need to think of AI not as a thing that plays a role in one space or in another, but as an active, ongoing partner in human cognitive work. That's novel. Up until now, many of our technologies have been physical. They help make the physical parts of ourself less fatigued by, you can blow up mountains and you can till fields and things like that with technology, but now we're thinking with these. So I think the area where we're going to see AI in training and education is as an active, peer level cognitive partner in everything that we do in terms of knowledge work. And that sits regardless of education or training, because in a corporate setting, you may need to analyze a competitor's strategic move in a new region, and you will use AI to sort of bring scope to the information, evaluate, provide some assessments that you can't see otherwise. In the same regard, we're going to see AI do the comparable thing in high stress academic environments, such as the COVID pandemic. And as an example, there was something in the range of several thousand academic papers published per week on COVID. There's no way a researcher can manage that. AWS, and through some of their tool sets and the natural language processing that's available to researchers, can help give structure to those multiple thousands of papers, and then allow the humans to see the salient elements and interact with that with an ongoing AI partner in the background. So I think it's the big area of AI is not going to be education or training, but just more knowledge work in general will have an AI component embedded in it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, George. That's a really good example about COVID. Thank you. Mike, did you bring this slide back up to make a point?
No, I wish we could get Dr. Karamata on the phone, because, with his experience at NASA, that prior question, on theory and application, on thinking and doing, he's got some just great case studies with his students that he could discuss. So maybe we can do that at another time, unless Sophia can get him on audio. But anyway, no, this is the point that George was, I think, making, back to this slide, that this really is, this network that we're talking about is really an epistemic network, and each individual and agent in that system has some knowledge. And if you believe in the bullets at the top, that knowledge within that system is intrinsically the common property of a group, then you lean on those individuals and the experts for their knowledge as you move through some complex design space. And so that's exactly the role of AI, to augment the learner, to make learning more efficient, to make learning more engaging and meaningful and personal, not to take anything away, but to really just expand it. And you do this now in a very crude way with your phone. If you're walking down the street trying to find out what pub to go into, you'll pick up your phone. Well, one, to get directions there, two, to get ratings there. So we're already augmenting our intelligence with these external devices. And so this would just follow you around, know you, know what you do, know what you engage in, be completely private. Data would be yours, protected by you, only offered through like blockchain sections of your knowledge that you wanted to contribute to the network. So I think it's coming, and I think it's going to be an interesting space. So,
Mike, thank you very much. I think this is another extension of the same question. It is, did you ascertain or capture the cultural capital of the students prior to beginning the course? And if I can embellish slightly, the reason why I think it's part of the same, the two sides of the same coin, is because it feels to me that you were talking earlier about T-shaped people, and we either grow the top of the T or we grow the depth. One usually has to come first. We can grow them simultaneously if we've got that skill. Usually one comes before the other. And therefore, understanding the cultural capital of the students who you have had beginning your course, I think this is a very good question.
Yeah, I agree. That's an excellent question. We did try to understand that dimension, and I think there's room to grow as far as instrumentation to better understand this space. But in the last run of the additive manufacturing course, we instrumented the ocean IPPD Big Five psychometric instrument. And it was an attempt to try to do exactly that. So we wondered if, and there were some data privacy issues, and there was an open agreement to share if you wanted to, or correlate it and drop it into a data lake so we couldn't identify the person. But what we were trying to do with that instrument, if you're familiar with it, the Big Five or Ocean, that was exactly what we were trying to do. We thought that if we understood the persona with a little bit more clarity, then understanding the background, the socio-technical background, the educational background, the domain expert background, their persona from a psychometric perspective, that those combined would be codification, could be codified, and then we could start looking algorithmically if there were nuances between the corpus of what they said and the natural language processing, when they said it, what they accessed, who they contributed to, who they helped, how they grew in the network, how they formed their ties, didactic or Similian, or the centrality of the emergence of the expertise in this network itself. What were the properties of that? But I think whoever asked that question, it's a really great question. And I think it's largely underexplored and researched, but I think it's fundamentally something that we have to understand and solve for before we move forward.
I could not agree with you more, Mike. I think that is a fundamental issue for us in engineering. Frankly, I agree entirely. To move on with another question here, Mike. Based on the data relating to learner experience in terms of time, the published was 3 to 4 hours per week, whereas the reality was up to 18 hours per week. Did you adjust the time for the course or manage expectations, in particular, bearing in mind future learner exposure to the course?
We did, and the students made it clear that we needed to. And so what we ended up doing is moving, we had the pre and post, and the assessment is another under explored area in this space. I mean, we could create a Q matrix and really get into really define, reflective and summative and formative, assessment strategies and rubrics that would comb through, from an AI perspective and help the student. And that in itself could help with adjusting the time when things were due. If it's the individual student themselves, then there is no bounds. They can go in and spend as long as they want, 50 hours in one module if they want to. So there's no time bounds, there's no semesters, there's no quarters, there's no, none of that stuff's due. It's only when they're engaged in the social activities and they're part of a group and they have to deliver something together, then those constraints come into place. So if it's synchronous, no. If it's asynchronous, there's more demands. But yes, we did have to adjust the time. We adjust the due dates on some of the artifacts that were graded because, this course, we got really high engagement in this course. The reason why we ended up with like 96% of the people who enrolled in this course completed it. I mean, that's unheard of in a MOOC. But at Boeing, we'll pay any engineer or technician to go to these classes. We pay for the tuition. The caveat is that if they don't get, if it's a C+, if they don't achieve a C+ in the course itself, then they have to pay it back. So there's a pretty high incentive to, once you commit, you look at the framework, you look at the investment it's going to take, you look at what you're going to learn, and if it's applicable to moving you through your career. And if all of those stars align, you say, okay, I'm going to pull the trigger on it. And then you sign up for the course, and that's your commitment that you'll pass the course. And when you pass the course, Boeing pays for it. But if you don't, you have to pay for it. And so really high commitment engagement, the 96%. The only reason we had 4% that didn't, these were people that literally, like, they had babies, they had their houses flood, they had house fires, they're like, that 4% were really, professionals that couldn't take the course. Not that they dropped out, they couldn't take the course because of extenuating conditions. But yes, we had to adjust the effort. And then also one thing we didn't do is go back and look at all the artifacts. And I think there was in one of the courses, there was 580 artifacts, learning artifacts. And I think the students all collectively only accessed 350 of them. So we didn't measure them for cognitive load. If the material was extraneous to the learning objective. We didn't look at we didn't atrophy what they didn't touch. So there was all this dead wood on the course that the ISD people said, oh, this is what we have to do. This is how they go from level 1 to level 2 and level 3. And then it just didn't work that way at all. So I think ISD has a lot to learn through, realistic engagement of the students as they interact, consume, and then drive some kind of proficiency in whatever knowledge structures that we build. So yeah, we did, bottom line, yeah, we had to make adjustments because it was too much.
It sounds like it. It'd be interesting to find out the range, but let's move on. Thank you very much, Mike. This is a question, what are the inferences that you are making about theories of learning that are emerging from your experience and from your analyses?
George, can you help with that one?
Sure. So, from a specific, if I could just clarify, from the learnings from our analyses, is there a particular direction that you prefer to be answered on in that regard?
I'm speaking for a colleague of mine, actually, but I think that it's what are the generic theories of learning that you are developing based on the experiences that you are having with these particular courses? What's the generic nuggets which you so far have discovered?
Well, from a few ends, at a really broad level, sort of theoretical in the learning framework, we're asking questions that I'm not sure how relevant they are traditionally. Meaning, a lot of our traditional assessment is driven by an ability to gain an insight into sort of fairly granular phenomena. And when you start to see people in a more robust space, and one of the interests I have, and I know Michael does as well, is around learning analytics, which is how do you start to take data to gain insights into what's happening in a series of courses and interactions. So one way to look at it is learning analytics at a certain level could be seen as a microscope that allows researchers to see what can't be seen otherwise. You might not be able to see the things you can see through data, through an experimental design, through a qualitative analysis, and so on. So because this happens in a digital environment, the simple formula I have is digital produces data, data sets the context for analytics, and analytics sets the stage for artificial intelligence. And so that's sort of the quad pathway that we're moving through. So what I'm trying to answer then, as I started, these data sources, the interactions that we're starting to see, there's new opportunities for understanding the modeling experiences of students in these different settings, creating adaptive and personalized pathways based on learner profiles or learner graphs. And I think you start to get a very different set of questions. In the past, with early stage research in digital environments, we were saying, does it work? What's the ideal interaction patterns in a discussion forum? And we had theories that were based on that stage of technology. We had community of inquiry, which was quite prominent. We had attention to the idea of communities of practice, which sort of emphasized some of the social interactions and so on. And now I think we're starting to ask very different kinds of questions, which is, can the addition of a non-cognitive or non-human agent play an equally comparable role in digital environments? And what does it mean if technology outlearns us, its capability at least? Which practices, which knowledge practices should we as people start to devote our time to? And what is a theory that will govern those kinds of interactions? Because the bulk of our learning theories are human-centric. Hardly surprising, because we're the only agent that we think is, performs at that level. But now with these other agents coming in, I think the three big things that I've tried to answer here are: one, we have better insights based on having more sophisticated overview. We can see differently with analytics than we can otherwise. Secondly, we can see systemically. We can start to see, and this produces modeling and modeling related behavior. And then being able to track and map and see how things might unfold. And then thirdly, we have the ability to start envisioning what is a theory of learning, or more accurately, a theory of knowledge processes, where humans are not the only or even the primary agent contributing learning back to that structure. And will constructivism or behaviorism or cognitive science, or my interest in network learning or connectivism, will those frameworks be sufficient to describe and predict the performance of agents in this kind of a human-machine interaction? So I think those are some of the learnings, if you will, that we're finding are more systemic rather than individual. Like, how long should a video be? It's more what kind of a system can encompass and explain what happens with knowledge work in these areas.
Very interesting. Thank you, George. The first part of this next question is very much directed at Mike. It says, a very enjoyable talk. Thank you. The question is, developing effective personalized learning involves understanding the environmental context. George, you've just been talking about similar things, that we've only ever really known this. How do you see learning analytics developing future to help us understand better the impact of the environment on the learner? And the environment, I'm presuming in the question, could be as broad as you like in terms of interpretation of what the question is. Mike, do you have a view on this?
That's a big question, and when I think about the entire educational system, if you think about post-secondary and even into primary and post-secondary, that these skills aren't the metacognitive skills and the relational and connective skills. They're just the self-regulated learning skills. They're not there. The system isn't designed to really teach that at that level of engagement and efficiency. But as they get into their undergraduate space, then that we can think about that as a system, and we can cut them loose, and we can allow them to interact. I mean, they're doing this right now. I mean, post-COVID, this is happening. Pre-COVID, went and tried to talk with universities to build kind of courses like this. There was a staunch resistance from faculty saying, no, never. I'm going to lecture and lecture and lecture. And Stephen Freeman, in a PNAS publication in 2017, published a meta-analysis on lecture, and he thought it was going to be the final nail in the coffin. But no, I mean, it's like lectures will not die. And I look at MIT now, and I think they said 94% of their freshmen are taking their introduction to engineering classes online. They don't even come to campus. And so I think post-COVID, we've moved past that space where the professors say, I have to lecture, because no one learns lecturing. You just don't learn. I can go back to it. I can watch a lecture. I had my son watching a lecture from Feynman at Caltech from 1956 on how to create a gyro with a box of sand to look at the Earth's axis movements in your room. And it's like, what a wonderful asset, right? But do I need that? Do I need to go sit in that lab with 500 other kids and 2 TAs? No. And so I guess the long-winded answer to this is that you're seeing pockets of innovation transform higher ed now. These kids have the metacognitive and self-regulated strategies to engage and learn, and they can get access to, and already do, a vast, capital of a vast network of capital, and it doesn't have to be from University X. And I think one of the questions I ask myself with the implications of how this is unfolding is, how many introduction to engineering courses do we need? Do we need 10,000 of them from 10,000 universities? Like if I was really shopping for this and I was out there engaging, what does that look like? If you have one of the best courses and it's rated and consumed like you do something in Amazon, and all the students go there, and it wasn't a residency requirement. I don't know the vicious and virtuous implications of how this system will percolate and how AI will impact the higher educational space. I think it's irresponsible that we're not looking at that from a scientific perspective. But I do know that the experiment is running, and I do know that it's going to change, and we're seeing pockets of disruption right now, especially with post-COVID. So I hope I didn't go too far off the tangent of the question. I fear I may have.
No, not at all, Mike. It's interesting, though, what you've just been saying, because at the moment, the we're trying to come out of lockdown at the moment. And universities across the country have seen huge percentages of their students coming back to campus even though they aren't being taught in person. And there's something social going on which we need to understand better, which transcends pretty much everything else. There's something interesting going on. Mike, thanks so much. I just need to point out to everybody that Charles Kamada, welcome to the meeting. It's about to end, but I need to say welcome because I've never spoken to an astronaut before. So this is slightly special for me. But you're very welcome to the meeting right at the end. Thank you very much for joining in.
Hey, Tim, thank you very much. And thanks to Sophie for solving the technical problem. Although many at NASA would like me to have a quiet microphone probably most of the time. But I just wanted to say that my good friend, Mike Richey, we've been working this for a long time, him probably longer than me. But he's one of the few people that looks at education as an entire ecosystem, and not just looking at, like many academics and specialists do, diving in to one particular area. And so I totally enjoy working with my friend Mike and George Siemens. And George and I are writing a book on high performing teams, for instance, and I'm writing another book on what happened after the Columbia accident and how did these engineers make this terrible decision. And what I've come to learn about even these accidents, which many people have not identified, is how these teams actually look at these anomalies when they are very weak signals, just like we're seeing, unfortunately, this play out in Boeing in the 757 Max. And so how these people, these teams of people, construct knowledge, try to understand what they really don't understand and trying to make some sense out of it. And even though they're specialized and they have expertise in multiple different disciplines that's needed to solve this problem, they're not used to solving these types of problems in an interdisciplinary converged way. And so the teams that looked at the Columbia accident, the foam that came off, the teams that looked at the Challenger accident were not the right teams, and they did not make sense of the problem adequately. And I think we could do tons to understand how these teams are performing and how they're acquiring knowledge, how they're constructing knowledge. The other thing I would say is the things that we're learning about teams is that we're measuring these behaviors, right? And so Julia Rozovsky and the Aristotle project at Google were trying to understand these patterns in these hundreds of teams at Google and what made some of those teams successful. And what they learned was that the underpinning of all these highly successful teams was something called psychological safety. And absolutely, those are the problems we had at NASA, not having a psychologically safe culture. But more importantly, these cohorts of students, the cohorts that are psychologically safe, so that the students feel free to raise their hand and say when they don't understand something and share knowledge, is very important. So we're learning more about how do you analyze these behaviors on these teams that makes these teams special and can accelerate learning. And that's all I had to say, Tim, and thanks for letting me join.
Oh, thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you. No, I'm beginning to understand why they would like to prefer you to be muted. But thank you very much. It's a really important contribution. Thank you very much, Joseph. Mike, thank you so much. And George as well. Thank you for your contributions this evening. It's been incredibly fascinating. The questions have been wonderful. The answers have been great. Thank you so much. And good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.